everyone, and welcome back to our series where we're taking a look at Nr.4s. These are the long recoil action shotguns that were either inspired by or derived from the Browning Nr.4. And today we have a particularly interesting example to show off. This is the Rheinmetall Nr.4. Now, we previously looked at long recoil shotguns from several different countries, and this is going to be the first but probably only example within the scope of this series that we're going to come across that originates from Germany. Now, specifically, the Rheinmetall Nr.4 was made between the years of 1921 and it seems like maybe 26 or 27 production had stopped. This sort of puts it squarely in that interwar German Great Depression era. Of course, most people are familiar that following World War I, Germany was on economic tough times, and the Rheinmetall company, which had previously made firearms that were maybe somewhat military-oriented but had also made some civilian firearms, shifted hard into the development and manufacture and sale of pure civilian market-oriented firearms. Now, the Nr.4 was not a particularly successful venture for Rheinmetall. Estimates vary, but it seems like maybe about 5,000 of these guns, perhaps less, perhaps more, were actually ever manufactured. However, what this gun does give us is a very interesting touch point into the minds of gun designers and gun companies, specifically in Germany back then, where they realized they wanted to make civilian market firearms, and their most obvious choice at that point was to make an automatic shotgun, because they realized that there was a pretty substantial market demand there in the early 1920s, late 1920s to do this sort of thing. In a previous episode, we'd looked at the Cosmi shotgun. This was another shotgun that sort of saw that inspiration or saw that gap in the market where you could make a better version of what existed, because really the only contender at this point was the Browning Nr.4 and licensed copies of it like the Remington Model 11. So Rheinmetall saw an opportunity to make a long recoil action shotgun, and by the time that they got around to making this gun, they didn't have to worry too much about Browning's patents anymore as they were coming closer and closer to expiring. Despite that, once we get inside this gun, we'll see that Rheinmetall didn't just go and copy an Nr.4, and that you could totally be excused for just seeing the outside of this gun maybe from 20 feet away going, that's just an Nr.4 that's maybe got something weird looking about it, but I can't put my finger on what. Once we see inside this gun, we'll learn that there's really no direct copy of Nr.4 going on here, except that it's got a friction ring system. But of course, we've seen that on other shotguns that share hardly any or no Nr.4 DNA at all. And this is another example of that. On the inside of this shotgun, it's a completely wacky, unique, really pie-in-the-sky sort of system going on in here. And hopefully, as we're taking it apart, we'll be able to understand a little bit more about why this solution would have been chosen, as opposed to just tweaking one or two things about the Nr.4 and then maybe calling it something else and selling a copy of it, which Rheinmetall could have done, but instead went a pretty different route. Now, unfortunately, there's not a lot more history about these guns that are known. It seems that they were predominantly sold in Germany or to German markets as far as commercial sales go. I have not been able to trace down any records of a U.S. importer having existed for these, but there are some publications in the U.S. that reflect the fact that this gun does exist. However, as far as I could piece together, they weren't saying that, oh, you could buy one from us or you could buy one from this importer. They're just saying, hey, there's a shotgun made by a company called Rheinmetall. It's an automatic. It seems that most of these were made in 16 gauge. I don't know if I'm comfortable saying all were 16 gauge, but all of the ones that I have had the opportunity to handle in person were. Even though this gun had such a short production run, there's sort of three predominant variants of it. They would continue to change barrel lengths and the design of the safety most specifically across the production run of the guns. Of course, I have this example here, and we will have some shooting footage with it. This gun does work well, all things considered. But I also have an additional parts gun that has a replacement forend that somebody, I guess, cast and then ground out of aluminum. Very interesting thing going on there. You see this with some Nr.4s way back when. Of course, aluminum technology much prior to like the 60s wasn't very good, but if what you're replacing is a wooden component, even that crummy cast aluminum quality is going to be better than that quality that you're, the strength, mechanical properties that you're going to be getting out of wood. But the important thing to see on this gun, besides the replacement forend and the very, very cracked stock it's got going on, is the different safety design. There would be 3 safety designs for these guns. Of course, we've got 2 types of those safeties here. This style, which is sort of the rear of the trigger guard, it's got a button that whenever you push forward on the trigger guard, puts the gun on safe, push backward on the trigger guard, puts the gun on fire. Sort of an interesting system there. Those are the chief differences with that parts gun. We'll put it to the side for now. Maybe we'll bring it back out when we're talking about flaws or weaknesses with this gun's design. But on our working example here, it's got a completely different safety design, where it's got a toggle that slides forward and backwards. Personally, I like the safety design on the other gun just a little bit better, but this being a German gun and being a gun that would necessarily have required extreme amounts of hand fitting, pretty much every piece of these guns is serial numbered to them, and so I don't want to go swapping between these two guns to get the trigger guard that I like better on this gun. But with those details discussed, what I'd like to turn to next is a sort of general feeling and understanding of the external features of the gun. Of course, one big difference in the Auto 5 is the layout of screws. That's something that a trained eye can sort of readily notice, is that this isn't just an Auto 5 because we've got screws in strange places. Of course, we do have the Browning style, a locking screw and then a actual primary screw. And we have some of these screws in similar places to where we'll see them on an Auto 5. But of course, this screw set and then the lack of a screw set down there is probably a pretty big giveaway that something different is going on here. We have a forend, which is a little bit taller than an Auto 5 forend and has a finger groove that's more of a suggestion than an actual finger groove. Whenever you go to grab the gun, of course, your fingers do still find it, but you can't nearly grab this as well as you can on an actual Browning. I'm not sure why this was done. As far as I can tell, this was the style that was original to these guns. Of course, on our parts gun, just to bring it back one more time, you have a much more serious finger groove going on there. Much easier to grasp this than the sort of lack of finger grooves that are going on here. I'm not sure if that was a stylistic choice or just meant to save time or manufacturing complexity, but very interesting shaped handguard going on there. We have a sling swivel there on the front and a sling swivel here on the back. As far as I can tell, the presence of sling swivels was original, though I believe this might be a replacement rear swivel here on the gun, and that the original swivel was closer in scale to this one for those sort of smaller, thinner straps. We have a semi-pistol grip here on the stock, which is somewhat unusual for European shotguns, especially of this time. The straight wrist was much more popular. However, I certainly do appreciate this with as short as this gun's stock is in terms of how the gun overall fits me. Having that pistol grip stock helps, because of course with the straight grip you end up putting the sort of wrist of your hand a little bit closer to your face, and with as small as this stock is, fitting me as a relatively large person, you end up sort of punching yourself in the face every shot, which isn't great. One interesting feature that we have here that is a feature that the Auto 5 has, but is executed differently, is the presence of a magazine cutoff. We will see this magazine cutoff design show up in later guns, so remember it, but as far as I'm aware, this might be the first time that it shows up, at least in a production example. Of course, this is the direction for the magazine feed system to be allowed to feed. When moved forward, we'll see whenever we have the gun disassembled, it prevents shells from coming out of the magazine. This would make it so that the bolt locks open after every shot. It would additionally make it so that if you needed to unload the gun to make it so that the chamber was empty, say you're hunting and you need to cross a stream or a field or something and you don't want a loaded gun on your back or pointing directions you can't account for if you're going to fall down, you could go ahead, flip the magazine disconnect on, jack the bolt back to get your one round out of the chamber, and then the bolt will lock in the rearward position because no more rounds can feed from the magazine. If you still wanted to close the bolt, you could, and closing the bolt would not feed another round from the magazine until you re-enable it and rack the bolt one more time. So magazine cutoffs are something that a lot of people don't understand the use of, and we talked about this in the original video looking at the Auto 5 itself. A lot of people sort of feel that this isn't a necessary or useful feature, and in a lot of cases and for a lot of users of shotguns it won't be, but if you ever find yourself in a situation like crossing a fence or a creek or having to jump across a creek or whatever when hunting, it's a really nice feature to have. And it's very interesting that as simple and as uncomplicated as they were trying to make this gun, Rheinmetall still felt that this was a useful or a necessary feature to go ahead and include. Looking back at the stock, all of the ones that I've seen have been sort of set up for right-handers, right? They have this sort of right-handed cheek piece. Makes no difference for me because I'm a left-handed person and I generally don't like how these cheek pieces feel on stocks that are set up for left-handed people. So I'm not a huge fan of that, but it was included. As far as I can tell, standard on these guns, all of them that I've seen have this. There's obviously been a replacement squishy butt plate on this gun that has started to deteriorate pretty severely. Probably have to replace that at some point. Besides that, we've already sort of discussed the safety. Of course, we have a trigger down here on the trigger guard. We have a bolt release in the same position as the Auto 5. And like the Auto 5s of the time, the loading gate is blocked until that button is held in, at which point you can then depress it and feed shells in. The large gap here between the front of the carrier and the receiver is a finger pinching machine. As you go to load this gun, it will consistently want to pinch your thumb in there and trap it like so. It's a very uncomfortable gun to load, and most of the controls on this gun are, of course we talked about it in the Yamamoto pointer video, another Auto 5, a Japanese made one. It was similar to this gun, meant to be cost reduced and cheapened and simplified as much as possible. And because of that, everything on it feels clunky or sort of grindy, like the parts don't quite fit together right. It's pretty bad on the Yamamoto, it's miserable here. Loading this gun sort of feels like you have to try multiple times and wiggle shells in and sort of bump the gun and shake it and hold it just right. It's really not a very smooth feeling gun mechanically. And of course, it being a German design, people normally associate some sort of machining or manufacturing excellence with German designs. I don't think that was particularly true, at least not of the Rheinmetall Corporation, especially not in the 1920s. Now, the final thing that we have to look at here is this charging handle. Observant eyes may notice this is a replacement charging handle. I do have the original charging handle for this gun, but an issue that's endemic to these things is that the charging handle, for the purposes of disassembly, has to be able to rotate out. Because of this, at rest, they have just a little bit of wiggle side to side. And this one doesn't have too much, right? That's just about the extent of it. Maybe 5 degrees either direction. But if your charging handle picks up more wiggle than that, and sort of, wiggles in one direction or the other, when the gun fires to recoil, that charging handle can catch on the edges of the slot for it to reciprocate in. You can see here on this receiver that this charging handle slot has actually been bent outwards, and that was from whoever had this gun before me, firing it with that original charging handle that didn't fit well. The charging handle caught on that slot and then bent the receiver quite badly. So one serious thing that you have to watch out for is charging handles on these guns that don't fit right need to be replaced, or the guns need to not be shot. And skipping ahead a little bit to my thoughts that I'll share in the conclusion section in full, these are not guns that are really meant to be shot all that much. They certainly can shoot, and if you have a working example that's got new parts and has been worked over, they are reliable. Right? This one's been pretty darn reliable for me. But these guns are not designed in a way that they sort of lend themselves to working or being durable over a long period of time. Just not designed very well, and the charging handle is only the beginning of that, but you can certainly see that's a serious flaw. Now, as we get ready to disassemble this thing, the other flaw that we'll end up looking at is the receiver is actually a split receiver design. It is not like the Auto 5 where it's got a trigger group that comes off the bottom and then a monolithic receiver. The rear end of this receiver is a part of the trigger group. This was done almost certainly to simplify manufacturing because, of course, on an Auto 5 receiver, you end up having to have a tool get all the way up in the receiver and machine pieces of it away, and that's very difficult. If the rear end of the receiver is open, you can just put the whole receiver on a mill or machine tool and get to the insides of it from the back, from the front, and from the bottom, which makes it a lot easier to work with than the Auto 5, which you can really only get to from the front and then part of the bottom. But as I was saying, because these receivers are separate, they just use a singular screw to hold the lower end of the receiver, the lower and back end of the receiver, onto the upper half of the receiver. And I have yet to see one of these guns where this screw isn't wallered out or damaged or has worn out threads on this side, which allows the gun to have just a little bit of wiggle between the two receivers. This gun actually fits surprisingly tight, and it wouldn't surprise me if work has been done to it to get it so tight. Meanwhile, if we look here at our bad example, there's a audible wiggling going on there, which is pretty severe, and would make it so that if and or when this gun gets repaired and put back to shooting condition, like currently it's a parts gun that needs a lot of work, but if I ever eventually get around to fixing that, it's probably going to need a new screw made there and then new threads cut here to make it so that the receivers are actually held together tight. Because currently that level of wiggle with the barrel and bolt slamming back and forward probably will just over time beat the pieces and bend the receiver and then eventually crack the receiver. And that is a incredibly thin wall between that hole there that holds the gun together and then the rear end of the receiver. Very thin edge distance going on there that I think can really only be explained by they didn't design this well and they probably didn't test it very hard. They came up with a gun, found out that it worked, and then threw it into production and hoped to make changes along the way. But with all that prefatory stuff aside, we are ready to start taking a look inside of this thing. Like most of these guns, our first step in disassembly is going to be to pop the cap off the magazine tube. There we have that. Next, the handguard will slide off. Here we have that. And then finally, the barrel will come off like so. There's a couple interesting things that we can check out here on the barrel. First off, I'm not sure if the barrel hoop here was forged integral or soldered on. If it was soldered on, it is a very, very good job of soldering it on that's on display here, because you can barely, looking at it, you can't really see a seam between the hoop and the barrel that normally you can observe if this is soldered on as a separate part. So it may have been forged integral, and if that's the case, it's pretty impressive for a gun where they were trying to save costs. We have a front sight ramp out here on the front of the barrel that does show signs of being soldered on, which is normal. Of course, forging that integral doesn't make a lot of sense. There's no good reason to do that. But out here we have a bead, which is cross-pinned onto the gun. Looking further back here, of course, we have a barrel extension, and the barrel extension has rails on it. So this isn't a thing like the CZ241 where the barrel just rides inside the tube of the receiver. They did at least go through the added complexity of adding rails for both the bolt and barrel to reciprocate on within the receiver. But as we're looking at the top of this barrel extension, we'll notice a pretty substantial difference. On the Auto 5, there's a square window that a locking wedge pushes up into. In fact, practically all of the shotguns we've looked at so far in this series have a square or a round hole for the locking wedge to come up into. Here we just have a singular cut, which is made on a slight helix as far as my eyes can determine, where it's not cut square to the rest of, it's not cut perpendicular to the bore. It's cut ever so slightly at a helix and only has a little bit of a locking shoulder there exposed. Finally, on this barrel, we have our fixed ejector. That's nothing we haven't seen before. And all else is pretty similar. Again, this is a 16 gauge gun, so if the barrel does look a little diminutive, it's because it's a 16 gauge and not a 12 gauge as we're used to seeing. Looking here at the handguard, we'll see that we do have that spring-loaded plunger system that we're used to seeing on the Auto 5. However, here on this cap, we do not have the serrations to make it click as it rotates. As best I can tell, they included this spring to sort of act like a lock washer, right, where it sort of detents this and holds it in place. Maybe there were originally notches cut in this and somebody ground them down. It's really hard to say. The cap from the parts gun doesn't have serrations either, so I'm inclined to believe this is just how it was. And they put the spring-loaded detent on there just to provide a little extra friction to keep the cap from coming loose on its own. However, because it lacks that sort of ratcheting detent system, I have seen these caps come loose if you don't snug them on there very tight before shooting. So that's something to watch out for. Is they cost saved here. They didn't put those serrations in there so it clicks and locks against that little detent, and as a result, you'll run into some trouble sometimes with this this cap coming loose as a result. Finally, looking inside on the handguard, we can see an incredibly diminutive sort of bridge of wood up here at the front, and then our routed out section all the way behind. Of course, this barrel hanger could have been placed further back to make it so that this bridge was a little bit longer. Not entirely sure why they sort of opted to use the dimensions they did. Of course, the further forward you put this hoop, the longer a spring you can get in your recoil system. So eventually it's a trade-off of lengths and distances and spring weights. However, that appears the trade-off that was made here was a handguard that is weaker because this bridge has a little bit less cross-section in it, for a spring system that's got a little bit longer spring, which you can use to then get a more favorable spring weight to keep the gun from bottoming out as hard on recoil. And with this gun set up right for the 16 gauge loads that I've been using in it, the recoil isn't the worst. In fact, I would say that the recoil on this might be a little bit better than the CZ241 in 16 gauge, although this is a little bit of a heavier gun than the CZ241 in 16 gauge. Finally, we have our friction system here, our barrel spring, which is nothing too interesting there. We have a control ring, which is dimensionally different than a lot of the ones we've seen so far, but works the same exact way. And then we have a friction piece. I have not seen one of these guns that has a tension band on this friction piece. If they existed, then the guns that I've seen didn't have them, but as usual, right, there's a chamfer on this ring, there's a chamfer on the barrel, and then corresponding chamfers on this ring. Under recoil, the barrel will lurch backwards into this ring and then pinch it down, closing up that gap and having it slide with a lot of extra friction against the magazine tube. You can then have this ring face either this direction, with the chamfer facing the ring to smash it down from both directions, or with the flat facing the ring, so that it only gets pushed down on the one end. And this sort of gives you a selectability or calibration to the amount of friction braking that goes on in the gun. But we don't need to over-explain that, because this system shows up in pretty much all of the long recoil shotguns that we've looked at. One additional difference compared to the Auto 5 is that we have a step here on the magazine tube. This is because the magazine tube does not have a locking screw that comes into it to hold it, and as a result, the magazine tube on these guns can be threaded in and out. Because of that, this step is necessitated so that shoulder on the step can bottom up flat against the receiver, such that whenever the tube is fully threaded in, the tube doesn't have any sort of perceptible wiggle, because having wiggle in the magazine tube, as we've talked about before, can lead to misalignment of the barrel and damage to the magazine tube, and eventually the magazine tube threads shearing off, and then the whole front half of your gun springing that way while you're left holding the back half looking stupid. But for the purposes of disassembly, just because we can do it here and we can't really do it on a lot of these other guns, we can go ahead and take the magazine tube out. Like so. In the front here we have our follower. We have a little bit of like a retaining ring that's again counter thread bore into the front of the magazine tube. You can thread that ring off to get the spring and follower out of there if you need to do maintenance on that. But otherwise, there's your ring. You probably need like some sort of a special tool or like one of those pin wrenches to be able to get that out of there. But that's your magazine tube. I've never had to take that one apart, but if you needed to, that's how you do it. Moving on here, we now have to separate our receiver halves. For that, we are going to need to get our tools, specifically some hollow ground screwdrivers. Pretty much all of the screws in this gun have been attacked by somebody who didn't use hollow ground screwdrivers, and because of that, we are going to do our standard disclaimer on this channel. If you're ever working on a gun, especially a shotgun, especially an old shotgun, make sure that you have a screwdriver set that has tips, right? The tips on the screwdrivers should be parallel, not tapered. If you go and look at the screws on like the light switches on your wall, right, you'll see that the tips, like the actual slot in those screws, is tapered. This is so that you can take a tapered screwdriver of any various size and get those screws out of there because the screws aren't very tight. The screws in guns need to be tight, right, because they're getting vibrated and jostled and all these sorts of things. Because of that, the tips on the screws are parallel. If you take a screwdriver that's tapered and try and shove that into a parallel slot, you're just going to damage the top of the screw without ever loosening it. So get yourself screwdrivers that have parallel tips that fit tight into the screws you're going to be removing, and then remove them gently. I am tired, perpetually tired, of seeing people damage old shotguns and screws because they get in a hurry and they want to use screwdrivers that aren't correct. And we can see here that this screw, even though it's meant to thread into this side of the receiver, doesn't actually thread in anymore. Those threads are stripped out, probably from somebody over tightening it. But as such, it's sort of tricky to get this screw out of there. There it goes. We now have those two screws. And of course you can see, right, there's our screw that's got one full thread on it that it threads into the receiver with. No wonder it ended up having a thread stripped out, right? You don't even have like you barely have a complete thread on there. Next up, we will remove this screw. And again, always remember to use appropriate screwdrivers. And in fact, for reinstalling that one, I may even go to my super skinny screwdriver size, because some of the slots in these screws are admittedly really, really thin, which is probably, it's done for a couple of reasons, right? There's reasons that designers of guns would use very thin screwdriver slots, and a lot of it has to do with disincentivizing you from over tightening the screws. They would hope that your screwdriver would break before the screw would end up damaging something. So they put a very thin slot so that your screwdriver tip becomes like a fuse to prevent you from damaging the gun or whatever it is you're working on. But at this point, we will hold the receivers together because they're under a little bit of spring tension. We will push that screw out, and the receivers will push each other away. And we now have our upper receiver and our lower receiver. You guys will have to forgive me. I am deeply uninterested in taking this lower receiver apart. Of course, you can take the stock off of the gun, and then you have an action tube like we've seen before. You can take that action tube off if you need to, and it's got that action spring guide rod and spring inside of it. That's all stuff very familiar to us from Auto 5s. We have a main spring that comes down into the stock and is held in with a screw. Never remove that screw unless you have a good reason to do so, because it's maintaining all of the pressure on this spring. But we can see our fire control group here is pretty clearly just lifted off of a Browning. Of course, we don't have the roller there on the hammer to reduce friction a little bit, but otherwise this is a very Browning-inspired system, and the various different safety systems you have will interact with the trigger or its spring in different ways to prevent the gun from firing when the safety is on. In a future video, maybe we'll do a detailed disassembly, reassembly video of this gun, and I'll get the lower end of it taken apart. But for the purposes of this video, we're just here to understand how the thing works and what makes it different and what makes it unique. So we're not taking the rest of this apart. But there you go. There's your traditional Browning double hook fire control group, just like we've got on the Auto 5. That's pretty much just a straight rip-off. Go ahead, kick the safety on, set this unit over here to the side. Which now brings us to the receiver unit, which we will continue to disassemble further because it is pretty interesting how this works very differently than an Auto 5. Our next step on this will be removing the carrier screws, one on either side. is one carrier screw, and we'll put it on our left side of the table because it came out of the left hole. Carrier screw heads have slightly different diameters on this gun, and they will not fit into one another's holes. Put the other one there on the right. And now finally remove the carrier screws themselves. This is our left side. No, sorry. This is our right side. Might as well keep that the same. And then here is our left side. And with that removed, the carrier will come loose and lift out of the gun. We can see that the carrier here is definitely inspired by the Auto 5, but has a lot of different shapes on it. Of course, this is not a direct copy of how the Auto 5 works, because as we'll see on the bolt group does not work the same way. As such, the carrier dog here is a little bit different shape. It has different shapes there on its tip, because it's going to lock against the bolt in a different way to hold it back and to facilitate feeding differently. But besides those features, right, it does still have the same parts, right? It's got a dog in the same place, on the same basic shape of carrier, and of course the bolt will come back, lock against this dog, and then load the spring on the dog, such that whenever the carrier then gets released, the carrier will spring up, release the bolt, and pop up at the same time. But that's how that sort of loading gate mechanism works. At this point, we will now be able to remove the bolt. In order to do this, you have to have the bolt retracted. Of course, the bolt closes in on itself, and we'll be able to see that better later. But you need to have a gap between the front of the bolt and the back of the bolt to push the charging handle down and then rotate it. But because this is a new manufactured charging handle, and I fit it specifically to this gun, it fits very tight. So you need a pair of pliers just to get it rotated over the last bit of the way. And here we have our charging handle. It's got this very interesting sort of double bayonet lug system, and we'll see what that actually locks onto on the bolt once we've got the bolt out of the gun. But there's that system there. It's probably overcomplicated, right? This is probably not the least complicated way to have a charging handle come off the gun, especially because later in history we'd see that just like the little spring detent pull out the side charging handles. They could have done that here if they had known about that. Instead, they went with this double bayonet lug system, which is kind of crazy. But it's got a little spring that sits in there as well, a small compression spring that sits in the base of the charging handle that sort of springs it away from the bolt body, and that's where you have to push it in before you turn it. That's of course the bayonet lug system. Everybody knows how that works. Put that to the side. Here's our spring for the carrier, very much like the Auto 5 actually. But finally, at this point, with the charging handle removed, we can pull the bolt out the back of the receiver, as opposed to the Auto 5 we're used to having it come out the front. Here, it comes out the back. Before we take a look at the bolt, which is probably the most interesting part of the gun, we will finish looking at the receiver. The way that the carrier latch works is identical to the Auto 5. We have a button that can press on it to depress it. It itself is just a flap of steel there in the receiver. And whenever a shell gets pushed out of the magazine, the shell will depress this end of it, which allows the carrier to come up and then the feeding cycle to begin. Then on this side of the receiver, just like the Auto 5, we have our shell stop. Whenever the barrel comes forward, it will depress that shell stop out of the way to let the gun know, okay, the barrel is all the way forward. You can then begin your feeding cycle or keep the bolt locked back, right? That's that part of that mechanical system. And then the final thing we have to look at here is our magazine cutoff. And you can barely see that. It's a little bit tricky to see, but as I flip this around, you'll see it flips that little pawl right there. When it's in this position, a shell cannot come back. When it's in this position, a shell can. It is possible to remove these components. However, it involves the use of a very, very tiny screwdriver on these grub screws that on this receiver don't want to come out. So for now, I'm leaving them there. Probably have to be heated up and then driven out with extra care at some point in the future. But with that all discussed, we now know how this receiver here works, and we can put it to the side. And now we close in on the most interesting part of this gun, the bolt group. And the thing that's most interesting about this bolt group is the presence of a cam track. That's not something that we've really seen before. Most of the systems we've seen are either a pivoting or a tilting, or in the case of the Winchester gun, sort of like a toggle knee-style rising locking system. This thing's got a rotating block, but it's not a rotating bolt. Of course, the bolt has rails, front and back, with this is the bolt carrier equivalent sort of, and this is the actual bolt itself equivalent sort of, but then it has a rotating locking member. As the gun comes forward into battery and feeds a shell, the front end of the bolt here will be stopped whenever it runs into the breech face there on the barrel. All right, so it's stopped there. You then have this system on the bottom of the bolt, It's not quite an over-center mechanism, but it works similarly to one where this sort of claw, this foot, is sprung so that it prevents these two pieces from coming together unless they slam together with sufficient force. If they slam together with sufficient force, or we just depress the claw to lift it out of the way, the bolt groups can then slide together. This is what happens whenever the gun is shutting. And I think you guys had seen me earlier, whenever I eased the bolt forward, it just stops like this until you pull it back and let it shut with a little gusto, at which point it will then shut all the way. As it goes to shut all the way, you'll see this central piece here will move to lock. Just like that. This is your locking shoulder. This locking shoulder is sort of cut on a helix that locks into the barrel there, and that is how lockup is accomplished with the Rheinmetall Nr.4. To show you guys the system up close, just because it is so interesting, we have our bolt here. There is our sort of latching system. It's really a premature bolt locking system is what that's there for, but it doesn't really stop it from premature locking. It just stops it from locking unless there's a sufficiently hard force that sort of shoves this spring up out of the way, or we can just sort of depress it here with our finger and then slide the bolt group together, and we can see there is the locking action. This is a really wonky system that, as far as I'm aware, doesn't really show up in any other shotguns. Of course, rotating bolt shotguns will be a thing later in history, but this isn't a rotating bolt shotgun. It's like a rotating block locking system. It's a very wonky thing. And as best I can figure, most of the weirdness about this gun, like the way the mag tube is set up, the way the receiver is split from its other receiver, the way that the barrel is set up, the way the locking system and bolt is set up, is because Germany in the 1920s lacked the advanced manufacturing capabilities that, say Belgium with their Auto 5s had. And as a result, Germany had to make do with machining and manufacturing processes that were a little bit more old school, where you might not have a mill or a lathe that you can dedicate to doing a particular operation. But you can have a squad of 100 guys that sit there with hand files and hand tools and maybe if they're lucky, some sort of like steam-driven grinding equipment that they can then make the parts from by hand and then fit those sets of parts together into complete guns. And you may not have a gun that can swap parts with another gun just like it, but the guns do still work. And most of the unique differences that I can identify on this gun, most of the weirdest things on it, are things that I think come down to a lot of this gun was made by hand. And it's not made by hand in the artisanal sense, it's made by hand for mass manufacture because they didn't have a sufficient quantity of actual machine tools. And that on its own is sort of a cool thing. We can take the bolt group further apart by rotating it over. The lock then rotates around, comes out like so. We can see that this thing is a mess. This was certainly a piece that needed to be made in a machine tool, but it has a cam lug there. It has interrupted locking studs here to hold it into the front of the bolt group. It has a pin that's recessed in the bolt group here that sort of sets its overall limit of rotation so that it can't rotate any lower in this direction. And of course, it's got its great big locking shoulder there on it as well. The front of the bolt group houses double extractors. We have one beefy extractor here that's got a decently strong spring on it. We then have this extractor here that isn't really an extractor. It doesn't really have the profile of a claw. I've checked the other guns I've had access to and they are similarly set up. I think really what this is doing more is sort of creating a false wall of the receiver such that when ejection happens, this end of the shell isn't just tempted to push this way. It sort of gives it so that it has something preventing it from getting pushed off the side of the gun this way as the ejector comes forward and tries to push the shell off of the bolt face. Additionally, we have our cartridge stopper here on the bottom of the bolt. Of course, on the Auto 5, the cartridge stopper is integrated into the locking block latch. We don't have a locking block latch on this gun. That's not how that works. The locking block is rotating, and it can rotate anytime it wants, regardless of the position of this foot here on the bottom of the bolt. So really all this wedge ends up being for is holding rounds into the magazine whenever the bolt is forward, because of course when the bolt is forward and the barrel is forward, this shell latch here is pushed out of the way, and if the bolt then didn't have this latch on it, all of the shells would just come out of the bottom of the gun or try to push their way onto the carrier every time the bolt and barrel were forward together, which isn't what you'd want. And then they put a spring here on this foot so that when you're loading the gun, it can sort of push out of the way just enough to get shells past it. And we'll see in the shooting segment, that's an awkward sort of crunchy process. It's not a Not a very refined feeling thing as you slide a shell past here. But with that discussed, we can look at the rear end of the bolt group. We of course have a bolt carrier tail, pretty familiar to us at this point. We have a firing pin, and again, apologies, I'm not going to take the firing pin out. It's a tiny little pin right there, and a tiny little pinhole there that you can use to drive it out. Just a simple cross pin that holds the firing pin into the bolt group. Perhaps in the future we'll do a detailed disassembly where we take it out, but for now we'll leave it in there. As far as I've been able to tell, these guns never had firing pin springs, so it does free float in there, and it's just that pin to get it in and out. We additionally have a pin there for holding the carrier tail on, and for similar reasons I'm not taking it off. Finally, we have a pin for holding on like our anti-block rotation locking tab thing, and that's right here. This tab is a remanufactured component. On a lot of these guns, you'll find that these tabs are broken, and when these tabs are broken, the jam that the gun will usually do is when it starts trying to feed, the locking block latch will lock against the barrel extension at the rear end of the extension instead of like when it's actually in the extension, which of course will prevent the gun from feeding or wanting to work at all. And let me tell you, this latch is a very weird part geometrically. It's got a lot of shapes on it, and of the guns I've looked at, I have seen dramatic variation in the sizes and angles and shapes on these. I think that this little locking foot here is a piece that was done, if not entirely by hand, majority by hand. Maybe it was a cast, like an investment cast part that then got ground to fit, and there's a lot of variation in how they fit. And by nature of how they work, right, this piece just continually gets beat up between the two halves of the bolt as the gun cycles. These pieces will get bent, and they will get damaged and chipped, worn out, and eventually cracked or broken. So this is one piece, another piece on these guns that's just not designed very well. I guess if I had to point to the three worst parts of the gun's design, it would be the way the receivers hold together and that screw with like a thread on it. It's not the best way to do that. This latch here is just very thin and very small, and it being on only one side of the bolt means that you sort of got a torque that's being put on the bolt as it comes into lockup. I generally don't like the way that that was done very much. And of course my final gripe would be the charging handle, and how if the charging handle doesn't fit into the bolt tight, it will end up bending the receiver after you fire it. You essentially turn your gun into a gunpowder driven receiver deforming press, which isn't great. And the final thing we have to look at here is how the charging handle actually sits into the bolt. There's a pin that is pressed into the bolt. You can see it from either end, so if you needed to get this pin out, I don't know that you'd have to drill it. I think you could just press it back out of there with the appropriate press tools. But the charging handle has its lugs interact with this pin. It sits down on there, then rotates over, and then the spring pushes it out to retain it. That's more or less how that system works there. It just doesn't make sense to me why this is the, they have to come up with a solution for a charging handle that's removable, and this is the solution they come up with. It's kind of a weird one, because the bayonet lugs on this charging handle would not be very easy to machine. They need to be precise enough. I don't think you could just net cast them, as well as they're spindly and thin enough on these arms. I don't think you could cast this. I think it had to be a machined part. So I really don't like the charging handle design on this gun very much at all. But that is what it is. I guess comes with the territory of a cost-reduced gun. I'd also mentioned that I would show you guys how the carrier interacts with the bolt. Of course, there's that foot there on the dog. It's going to lock into that sort of half-moon cutout there, like so. Whenever the bolt comes back, it will depress this foot on the carrier, and then the dog on the carrier, and we'll hold it depressed like that. And the carrier will need to then spring up and rotate for the bolt to come forward. And as it comes forward with the carrier in the upwards position, the shell will be fed into the gun. And we'll see more of that in the shooting segment, but really the actual shell tendering, the way the gun works in terms of shell tendering, is identical, right? It's exactly lifted off of the Auto 5, down to the inclusion of a shell magazine cutoff. However, the shapes on all of these parts is different. The way the pieces fit together is slightly different, but it has the same parts that serve the same role. They just go about it in slightly different ways, which is always cool to see. It's sure it's reinventing the wheel, but it's reinventing the wheel to try and make it simpler, more cost-effective, or to work with a novel locking system, and that's always cool to see. But at this point, we have the gun all the way taken apart, and the one thought that I want to share at this point is it's actually only slightly easier to take apart than the Auto 5 because the bolt group doesn't have as many like taper pins or awful stuff going on in order to get it out of the gun. So it gets one small props to this gun is it's slightly easier to take apart than the Auto 5, but only slightly, and there's a lot more negative besides that, what with the three major things we've already touched on. But not the hardest gun to take apart, and now we will go ahead and fast forward through the reassembly so that we can send you guys outside so we can do a shooting segment, and then once we've finished with that, we'll come back in here for conclusions and final thoughts on the Rheinmetall Nr.4. And just like that, our Nr.4 is reassembled. Despite how different it is compared to the Auto 5, it's a little bit easier to take apart and a little bit easier to put back together. Really the only complicated part of the assembly process, I'd say, is getting the carrier tail to line up with the action spring plunger down in the stock as you sort of guide the two receivers together. It's just one of those things that you just have to keep trying and trying and trying, and eventually it'll feel like it'll go, and then you almost pinch your finger as you do it, and then you're able to rack the bolt, make sure it's got spring tension, and then go from there. But that's pretty much it as far as the mechanism, the inner workings of the thing. Let's go ahead, see what it's like to shoot, see what it's like to load, see how the crunchiness of the gun actually works out. And then once we've had an opportunity to shoot it, we'll come back here for a couple of final thoughts and conclusions about the Rheinmetall Nr.4.
Well, we're outside here with our Rheinmetall Nr.4, do a little bit of clay shooting with it. Now, as a standard disclaimer that we usually do, we're shooting at targets that are very close. The reason for this is I want you guys to be able to see the targets more so than me to have difficult or more challenging targets to shoot at. This saves me from having to miss as often, and it also makes it so you guys can at least see what's being shot at. Because of course nobody wants to shoot a shotgun or watch a shotgun being shot when they can't really see what it's being shot at. And shotguns are notoriously difficult to frame in terms of camera shots to be able to see the gun and the target in motion and then the tracking and the shooting. It's sort of a tricky thing to do. And that's why we have targets so close. All that said, the only other thing I would like to get out of the way is that the Rheinmetall Nr.4 is not a particularly reliable gun. As we went over whenever we had it on the tabletop, it's got a lot of jankiness going on inside on its design. It was not a gun that was designed to work well. I'm not even comfortable saying that it was a gun that was designed to work. It was a gun that was designed to be very cheap and easy to manufacture with a sort of lack of machine tools in post-World War I Germany. So if the gun does run into cycling trouble, we'll just sort of leave that in. This is not a gun that I have been very successful in tinkering with as far as making it 100% reliable. Of course, in our video on the Hjorgren, I went over the troubleshooting and the steps I took to get it running pretty darn close to 100%. This thing's just never worked that well, and the parts that I think it would need in order to make it work 100% are like making a whole new receiver and making a whole new bolt and making a whole new barrel so that they fit together without a ton of slop. And that's really just not very feasible because at that point it's no longer a Rheinmetall Nr.4. It's a gun that you made that's like that, but made correctly. So we'll have to bear with any malfunctions we have. Some days I've taken this gun out to shoot, it runs great. Sometimes it consistently wants to have feeding and ejection trouble. So we'll see which version of the Rheinmetall we're getting today. Now, loading the thing is very standard, very familiar to us. We will pull the bolt back, it will lock in the rear position. At this point, we are going to take shells one by one into the chamber, press the button to close the bolt. Then, of course, we have a gun where we have to hold the button in. Pretty standard for the time, but we'll hold the button in, which will let us push the carrier up. When the button's not pushed, the carrier won't move. With the button depressed, we can push shells in. This is as clunky and as gritty as it gets. And you usually just have to shove the shell in there and it will beat the heck out of your thumb as you do so. Again, nothing on this gun was made very well. It all just sort of wants to fight you and feels like, I don't know, like a Neanderthal or a barbarian shotgun. It's very not smooth, right? If you sort of contrast this with the Auto 5, you could almost push shells in there with your pinky on the Auto 5. With this, you need your thumb and velocity behind it to really get it going. But now with the thing loaded, we're able to shoot. There were several different versions of safeties as we talked about on these guns. On this gun, forward is safe, rear is fire. Some other guns had it on the rear of the trigger guard, multiple different kinds of safeties, but this is the version we've got here. You do sort of feel it the whole time you're holding the gun, right? Your finger is up against it, and I could definitely see it getting bumped on accidentally, especially under recoil. One thing to be aware of. The final thing I'd like to discuss is that we are, of course, shooting 16 gauge because this is a 16 gauge Rheinmetall. The particular 16 gauge loads that we're using are 1 ounce at 1150 foot per second. So it's a pretty typical, right? That's a light 12 gauge load or a fairly heavy 16 gauge load. But that's what we got loaded up. We'll see if we can't hit a couple of targets with it. My head does not fit correctly on this stock. We'll talk about it more in a second, but it is a tricky gun for me to be able to shoot. Did the same thing again. So I am going to blame those 2 misses on the gun, because I don't think it's my fault so much as how the gun fits me. The stock is so darn short on this thing, and the comb is just in the right spot where I can't, depending on which part of my cheekbone I want to put on the comb, I'm either too high or too low. Additionally, like the way the front sight ramp works on this gun is if you put the bead on the receiver trough, the thing hits way high, and then if you put the bottom of the base on the receiver trough, it hits way low, like you've got to cover everything you want to shoot. So I'm not entirely sure if the sight picture was just one where you're supposed to guess, or maybe these guns didn't exactly have that. But of course, making them work was already a very high bar. Making them capable of hitting stuff was probably a lofty goal at that point. But they are shootable, but just the way that this particular gun fits me, I have a really tricky time shooting some targets with it. But now that we're done making excuses, let's go ahead, get the thing loaded back up, and we'll try 5 shots from the gun at a low position. God, my thumb is getting tired of getting smashed in this gun. But we'll try 5 shells from a low position, sort of to simulate maybe more like upland hunting style shots where you don't have the gun up in your shoulder, you're not ready to shoot until you've seen the target. So we'll go ahead, get ourselves situated here, and then take the gun down in our hip. Ah, there we go. So this is one of those jams on this gun that terrify me, because if you look closely, the extractor punches the center of the primer, and sometimes, I don't think it did it on this particular one, it didn't do it. Sometimes it will leave a pretty decent dent on those primers, and I'm always worried that it's just going to, set one of those off out the ejection port. So of course, I always wear safety glasses when I shoot, doubly so when I shoot weird, sketchy guns like this. But try another one here. It's not bad. Again, not terrible. Maybe the secret to shooting this gun is I have to not think about it. Okay. As much trouble as I have shooting this thing whenever it's, in my shoulder and the stock doesn't fit my face, blah, 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 all these excuses, I'm going to be honest with you, I've never shot it from the hip before, and that was just really, really easy and intuitive. I'm going to go ahead and try that one more time, do a couple more shots here with the gun out of my shoulder, just to see that again. But then once we've done that, we'll go ahead and do a little bit of slow-mo. But with it reloaded here, try one more time. This is kind of scary. Okay, all right. I decided on that last one that I wasn't going to try picking up the sights at all and would just shoot where the gun was pointing, and I found the limit of my skill. But this thing does shoot. I'm very, very surprised, because I would not call this a naturally pointing gun, because my face doesn't really fit on the stock at all. But despite that, it did a shockingly good job there. Of course, some of that's going to be owed to the fact that this is a fairly open choke, right? So usually we're shooting a lot of full choke guns here at close targets, which makes very precise lead important. This gun's got a little bit more of an open choke that's not as big a problem, but still, that's kind of a surprising result for this silly old thing. So I take back 5% of the mean things I've said about this. You can at least shoot it sometimes pretty well, even if you're me. All right, and to wrap things up here, we'll go ahead and put 3 rounds into the gun. My thumb hates me. And we will shoot these in slow motion, maybe do a little bit of fast shooting in slow motion just to let you guys see the action work, and then we'll head back inside for some final thoughts here on the Rheinmetall.
Well, folks, that's about it for everyone's favorite German long recoil rotating block operated shotgun. Throughout my studies and research about the Rheinmetall Nr.4, I've come across patents or even potentially prototype examples for other German long recoil shotguns, but so far as I'm aware, at least as of today, this is the only one that saw any sort of serious serial production. And it may have been a thing made to make money, and it may not have been made very well, and it may have had a lot of hand labor put into it. And it's not like the sort of hand manufacture that you see going on in Italian guns like the Cosmi, where they don't have a lot of machine tools used because they want to spend a lot of time on the gun. Here you don't see a lot of machine tools used because they couldn't afford machine tools and were trying desperately to make ends meet in a ravaged post-war economy. And through that lens, the Rheinmetall Nr.4, for all of its flaws, is an okay shotgun. However, I feel the need to qualify that statement pretty severely. If you're the sort of person who wants to buy like a cool long recoil action shotgun or whatever, I would recommend against buying one of these if you have any intention or expectation that you'll be able to shoot it and enjoy it. Most of the time you find these guns, they're broken or missing parts or don't fit together right or don't work properly. And the problem with this gun, as opposed to other old shotguns that are missing parts and need new pieces made, is a lot of the pieces of these guns was fit individually by hand to the specific gun that those parts came from. So with something like the Hjorgren, we have a separate episode looking at the Hjorgren inertia-operated shotgun. Those guns are also very old and also missing a lot of pieces and need parts remade. But across the great number of those guns that I've been able to see or work on or make parts for, there's very, very little variation one gun to the next when it comes to the intricate little parts of the gun. It seems like they were actually working off of a set of blueprints and having parts match those blueprints. For the Rheinmetalls, it's more of a situation where it seems like most bets are off. The actual length or sizes or shapes or angles on various pieces can differ pretty substantially one gun to the next. This charging handle fits very tight in this gun. If I try to put it in that extra parts gun that I have, fits wobbly loose, right? It's not even remotely close to working. It's like a difference of over 10,000ths of an inch in diameter on that, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's pretty substantial because any more wiggle than this and the charging handle is going to be deforming the receiver. And so for those reasons, even though you may think these are cool, or maybe you may think like a German automatic shotgun is kind of a rare thing, I wouldn't recommend you hold your breath on trying to get one of these because they kind of suck. I think it would be much more interesting and much more entertaining and worthwhile to own even multiple Franchi 48s before it would be interesting or worthwhile to own one of these because you're not going to be able to get to shoot these very much. Additionally, the 16 gauge guns were chambered originally for 2 9/16 inch shells. I put 2 3/4 inch shells through them and they run fine and they're reliable. I'm not necessarily reminding or advertising that you should do this, though. Of course, I did this cautiously and step by step at first to make sure there were no pressure signs or no issues that were going on with the gun. However, as a rule, I do not recommend to you guys that you go and put shells that are longer than your guns are chambered for in your guns, unless you're pretty sure that you know what you're doing. But owing to the fact that these guns probably want that shorter size of shell, which is more expensive, and the fact that they're picky and they're not the most reliable guns, and they break parts, and the parts are hard to remake for the guns, I'm going to leave you guys with a word of caution of, do not want this gun because it will only disappoint you, and even though it's sort of got a funky mechanism, there's nothing redeeming here or good or worth having, as opposed to a Franchi is a gun that was built from the ground up to be better than the Auto 5. This wasn't built to be better than the Auto 5, it was built to make Rheinmetall money because they desperately needed it in post-war Germany. And while that's cool and significant for historical reasons, it means that this is not a gun that was meant to be shot very much, and it is not a gun that handles being shot very much very well. Meanwhile, something like a Franchi 48 or an actual Auto 5 or the Remingtons or the Remington 1148 or any of the other things that we've looked at, really even including the Yamamoto Pointer Auto, were all built to last in a way that this gun couldn't have possibly foreseen. In future episodes, we'll be getting into some other shotguns that are like probably better buys, if you will, more interesting or more shootable or more useful. But I wanted to include this episode at this point because it is a very early example of an Auto 5. It's really a complete redesign of the Auto 5. And it's German, and we really won't have hardly any other German examples to show off in this series of long recoil shotguns. Now, stepping away from the lens of, is it a good idea to own one of these? What's it actually like to shoot? It's okay, I guess. It's maybe slightly smoother than the CZ241 in 16 gauge, shooting the same loads. But that CZ241 then is a lighter weight shotgun that I feel points better and fits me substantially nicer than this thing does. And the CZ241's receiver doesn't go ka-chunk, 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 ka-chunk. And it's not at risk of going ka-chunk, ka-chunk, ka-chunk worse the more you shoot it. Besides the overall recoil feel and sort of poor way this gun fits me, all of the controls on this gun feel horrible. The way that the bolt and charging handle interact make it so that the bolt wants to bind up as you're pulling it back. The bolt release grinds against the carrier, feeding shells into the gun, grinds against various different things. Nothing in the gun feels particularly smooth. And as such, really the only positive things that you can say about this gun are, it came from an interesting point in history. Okay, so did many of the other things we've looked at. It's got an interesting mechanism. I guess that's true insofar as it's a unique mechanism, but I think there's a reason you don't see many other things try to copy this mechanism, and you didn't see this mechanism stay in production for very long, and that's because it's not a very good mechanism, it wasn't done very well, and nobody wanted it. However, at the end of the day, the Rheinmetall Nr.4 is a necessary chapter in our look through the history of the Nr.5s, and I'm happy to have been able to show you guys one that works and then one that needs some work. If you guys have enjoyed this video or enjoy the other sorts of videos we do, like taking deep dives in gun history, or sometimes on this channel that's called Printing Guns, we look at printed guns even, I would appreciate if you guys could go and support me on the Patreon link in the description. Of course, no pressure or obligation to do so, just you guys watching these videos or leaving a comment is enough to make me want to do these videos, but ultimately, making these sorts of videos requires money, and the more money I can receive in support, the easier it is that I can make these videos on a faster schedule. I rely on the patrons over on Patreon not just for, of course, financial support, but sometimes I'm not sure what videos to prioritize or what you guys exactly would be interested in. So besides just suggesting things in the comments, suggesting things over there really helps me sort of figure out what it is you guys want or what it is that's most interesting to people so that I can continue to give you guys stuff that is worth your time and my time and perhaps pays homage to the relevant parts of history that lack documentation. But with all that said, I've rambled on for plenty long enough at this point. I hope you guys have enjoyed this look at a really weird shotgun, and I look forward to seeing you guys next time.